Thanks a lot for having me, and welcome to my talk, DIY Components, Why and How. I'll start with a short intro about myself so you know who I am and why you should or might be interested in listening to me. I'm Julien, this is me. I've been building web apps and websites since 2009. I started a long time ago using old tools, older than jQuery, and now working with React and lots of much more interesting tools than we had at the time. I work at a company called Healthy.io. We're in the field of digital healthcare. We build exams, medical exams that are traditionally lab-based. We build versions that you can do from home. We do that mostly with urine tests. And I spend a lot of my time contributing and maintaining React boilerplate. And I think that the name is a bit self-explanatory, but you can think of us as like a very opinionated Create React app. There's a full stack of tools around React in addition to just React itself, which obviously is not sufficient to build a large single-page application. And we've got 21,000 stars on GitHub, so we're actually quite big. We're about to release version 4 with a totally different stack, including Immer and lots of new interesting tools. And there's lots of documentation there to teach you how to build a large single-page application with our stack in particular. So don't hesitate to check it out. And I'm kind of on Twitter in that I do have a handle, but I don't really tweet anything. But I put it there in case for some reason anybody wants to ask me a question or reach me. So that's that. So what are we talking about today in this particular talk? Web components is sort of the title of the talk, but it's a bit confusing, I think. First of all, I'm not talking about web components, specifically the group of specs. I'm talking more about generally small, interactive, and reusable widgets. And do I mean inputs? Kind of, yes. Actually, I am talking about inputs. I'm talking about anything that your users can interact with on the page, input data into them. But at the same time, I'm not talking about just the input elements that we have. I'm talking about all the other inputs that you as a user, you as a developer, might need to build for your users. And we'll get into what I mean by that a little bit more. And I see these inputs as sort of a basic building block in most of our work. We use them all of the time, and sometimes we even make them ourselves if the ones that we have available are not the ones that we need. So what about these inputs? I think that knowing how to build components of this type is a skill in itself. If building a web app is one level of abstraction, then building sort of the building blocks, these elements, that would be, I guess, one level of abstraction under that. So naturally, you go one level of abstraction lower, and it's right away more complex. And I also want to convince you that that knowing how to do this is an essential skill, is something that we should all aspire to have as front-end developers, and that it's extremely valuable. I want to show you, and hopefully you probably will already know this to a certain extent, but it's often a very, very complex endeavor where some amount of complexity that you put in there begets and creates more complexity. And so we'll look into why that is. We'll look into how do we get better at it. We'll see sort of some of the challenges that you can run into when doing something like this, and how we might get better at dealing with those challenges. I'm not going to be building a component in front of you. I want to just instead show you from a high level sort of the issues that you run into, and sort of extract from this principles and sort of insights that we can apply across not just the development of components actually, but also in general development itself of more things. And before we continue, I just wanted a disclaimer that I'm going to be using select as an example a lot throughout my talk, and that's on purpose, is because we know and understand it quite well. And so, without further ado, let's get started. Just a brief point on HTML history before we get into the the deepness of things. So when HTML1 first came out, we had none of this actually. We only had tags that allowed us to display information on a page, like basically just reading a document. And then HTML2 came out, and we got the first interactivity. The first elements of interactivity, input, select, and form were in there. And since then, we've obviously added a lot more elements. These all came inside of HTML4 or 5. Some of them even HTML 5.2. We'll look at that in a second. And even if you don't use all of these, and there's more than just those, of course. Even if you don't use all of them, they're here, and the fact that they're there and they exist is also something that matters, and we'll talk about that. One thing that I want to highlight about a lot of the HTML elements that we do have is that they come with a lot of advanced features. They come with a lot of things that we don't really think about or we don't necessarily realize when we're building our own elements. And I want to really get deep into that. And so, getting back to the slide, I think, at this point in time, HTML, just the way that it is, covers a lot of our needs. That being said, there's still a big gap that we need to bridge ourselves somehow. I want to talk about that gap. I want to talk about what's missing in HTML if you were just building an app with just HTML, right? And the first gap that I see is the fact that the elements that we do have aren't always designed the way that we need them to be designed. So, for example, this is an example that's already been used today, I can't use native select to build this, or at least not without, probably Houdini might fix this, but that's far from being ready, clearly. And it's sad that I need to completely rewrite the select element to do this. And what's even sadder is that if you want to tell your designer, the designer that you're working with, how long it will take you to really implement this, they'll look at you strangely and be like, but it's so simple, and understandably, they'll be surprised. And the second gap that I want to highlight is that sometimes there are elements that we think should exist as native HTML elements, but don't necessarily exist. Like this, for example. A simple modal dialog. This is something that I'm pretty sure everybody here has got to have built at least once when building an app or a website. It comes up so often. And my question for you is, did you make it feature complete? Did you think of everything that needed to be built inside of it? Some of the basic things that we might forget when we do this, and you'll probably run into this all the time on the web, is, for example, the ability to close it with the escape key, or the ability to click on the background and also have that escape. Sometimes it's just a dark pattern. They don't want you to be able to do it because they want to force you to read the content. That's a different issue. There are more advanced features that we don't think about when we look at this the first time, but that people who are using screen readers will rely upon. So something like when you open it, capturing the object where focus was when the dialog was opened, and then once the dialog is closed, restoring focus to where it was before. That's something that is there in really advanced accessible dialogues. Something else was the user, when this is open, was the user able to scroll the background content. That's a bit problematic. It can happen on mobile as well, where you have a modal that takes up most of the window, and yet if you scroll on top of it, the touch event gets through and it's scrolling the content in the background. That's not really great UX. The good thing about this one in particular is that we now have these two things, dialog tag and for method equals dialog. And these are actually in HTML 5.2. Not everyone has heard of these though. I don't know how many people here have never heard of these tags, dialog tag. Right, I'm seeing a lot of hands. These are in HTML 5.2, and just the same way that many here haven't heard of it, there's also a lot of browser vendors that haven't heard of them, and it's going up. So you might not want to use this without a polyfill. Something else that's also brand new in HTML is, for example, progress. So the ability to show some kind of a loader, a progress bar is now in there, but if you try to use it or to style it, you'll also realize that maybe it's not exactly what you're interested in building, and so you'll end up building it manually, and it will only serve the purposes of the people who can actually see it, because it's very hard to do accessibility manually on a progress bar. And then the third gap that I want to talk about, that I want to highlight, is that there are components that might be considered too opinionated or just too hard to standardize into sort of native HTML elements, into their own specification. I'm talking about something like this, which is really not that crazy, but, oh, the video doesn't play automatically. There we go. I'll just give you a few seconds to understand what's happening here. It's just a multi-select with a very different UX from the natural one. And it's very close to the one we saw in Offerstock, just without the super beautiful animations. Okay, so what's plan B? You know, we've seen that HTML in itself has some gaps compared to what we really need to build in our everyday work. And the truth is that many of these issues have been solved for us. People have written many high-quality component libraries that, and by the way, it took me 5 minutes to find this many logos of component libraries. If I'd spent 10 more minutes, I could have filled the screen with 100 of them. There's so many of them, and not all of them, but there's quite a few of them that are very high quality. So, you know, whether you're building something with vanilla JavaScript or jQuery or the Web Components API, there's also library frameworks on top of that, or a framework like React or Angular, there's a good chance that what you need has already been built by someone and made available publicly in a component library. And as I said, they can be pretty great, but they also come with their own downsides. There's a few reasons why sometimes they might not be the right fit. The first one is that they're not always maintained. That can be a big problem if they have peer dependencies. So I don't know, you're working with React version X, which React version 15, for example, and they're relying on a certain old context API that's since been deprecated, and you want to upgrade your app to React 17, which will probably, I'm assuming, make this old context API obsolete. You can't really do that unless the component library is also maintained. So that's the first issue. They're also obviously much harder to debug. It's not your code, so you're going to have to go in and figure out what's happening. And they can also sometimes be over-engineered. A lot of complexity grows into them as they start to add more and more stuff inside. And the third thing is that they can be bloated. They can, add a huge amount of JavaScript to your bundles. It's not something you really want. Or you can even make mistakes in importing them. If somebody uses Material UI and accidentally imports the entirety of Material UI instead of importing a specific component, I think you'll be adding something like 15 megabytes of JavaScript to your bundle. And you've essentially made your app completely useless, right? Not useless, depending if you live somewhere with excellent internet, but for most people, you've really put them in a bad situation. And so I say all of this as someone who uses component libraries all the time at work. I simply, can't afford to painstakingly build every single component that I'm going to use in my apps. And the gain in productivity is just too important, and you wouldn't see me advocating against their usage. So I'm talking about something sideways from this. And in many cases, we're covered by these component libraries or by native elements. They do come with constraints, as we've seen. But for all the other situations, we're going to want to build our own components. So how do we do it? What does it take to write our own components? The first thing you're going to want to do, not in that order actually, but one of the things you're going to want to do is writing the API. How your component will be used by yourself and other developers who are going to also use that component. The second thing is the UX, the behavior of your component, how people will interact with it, and I'm also including in there style and animations because they don't deserve their own points. They're less important for this talk. The third point is to make it accessible. We're going to go into this a bit later. To make it performant and to maintain it. If you don't want, as we discussed, if you don't want it to become unusable a couple of years down the road, you need to make sure that it's up to date. So I don't have time to cover everything here. It's, writing components is a massive topic, and I'm sure there are probably books on it. What I want to do is, as I said, just really sort of extract some principles from my experience doing this. And I think that what I've come up with fits into two broad categories, and they have to do with sort of the stakeholders involved in your component. On the one hand, the users, and on the other, the developers. So I broke it down into two categories. The first one, won't somebody please think of the users? So this one's obviously about the users. If you think you can guess the title of the second section, you're probably correct. And if, never mind, going on. So when we started out, we looked at this design, and we noticed early you can't build this, or there might be solutions, but they're very complicated. You can't really build this with native select, especially if you want to add an image. If these were countries and you wanted to add a little flag, for example, same issue. So if in most cases, you'd have to completely re-engineer this HTML element. And you can sort of do that, but bottom line, is it going to benefit your users? That's the first question that you should ask yourself. And the only reason that you might want to do this in the first place is because this is much prettier, obviously, than this. We can agree upon that. Or even worse, for people who have older iPhones, this. We understand why design is called for, and why designers really attach importance to it. It's their job. But what are we losing when we build this from scratch instead of using a built-in select? And I'm just talking from the perspective of the user right now. Well, it's in large part about how good of a job we can do, obviously, and whether or not you have the time and the ability to do that job properly. So first off, do you have the time to make it accessible? And do you have the time to make it performant? Can it be focusable? Can it be focused? Did you think of maybe the power users, people who might want to use it with keyboard shortcuts, and figuring out exactly the UX for keyboard shortcuts is definitely not trivial. Did you think of all the edge cases? For example, what if when the user is trying to open this is the edge of the screen? What do? Do you show the options in a different position? Do you make the box with the options shorter so that it's then scrollable? That in itself is quite a complicated thing to figure out, and as you build this, you realize how much more you're adding to your component. And there's so many more of these edge cases throughout all of our elements that are already built into the native select, obviously. So I think that's the question. Ask yourself before you build something, is it the responsible choice? I think we've seen, unlike this guy who's not making a responsible choice, it seems, I think we've seen so many of these that are all over the web that are either not very usable or not accessible, and if you want to make the responsible choice, your priority should really be thinking of the users first. So what do you do in this situation? Maybe you want to talk to the designer and attempt to find a compromise, and maybe that compromise would be, well, in this situation that we've got here, nowadays you can style the select portion up here without the options. So maybe you can come to that compromise. That's on a case-by-case basis, obviously. Now, obviously, there's also a very big caveat to this point that I just tried to make. This applies only to situations where you're replicating a built-in element, something that already exists. But as we saw earlier, there's other situations if you're building something that isn't really in there in the first place. And also, another situation is if you're building a custom component for educational purposes, just for yourself, for learning how to do that, and I can't recommend doing that enough. I mean, you'll learn so much along the way. If you haven't gone down that rabbit hole yet, please be my guest and do it. It's also quite fun. So the other situation that we didn't mention is if you're building something that's not standardized in HTML, like the dialog from earlier. So, as I said, I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have built this manually at least once. And did you make it whole? Did you remember to take care of the focus behavior as we discussed, the scrolling behavior, and so on? So if you do go the custom route, my second piece of advice is make it feature complete. Make sure that you built into it everything that needs to be thought of. And when you're looking for inspiration for understanding what means feature complete for your particular component, look to native elements. They're not perfect, but they have a lot of things built into them that are really interesting. And also, the advantage is that you're going to be reusing patterns that people already know. If you're inventing completely new UX for a completely new component, people might have a little bit of a hard time figuring it out in the first place. You're creating friction. It's not good for you or for them. And also get feedback from your users from something that you've built. Okay, moving on, the final point that I want to make in this section is simply making it accessible. I want to take a minute to talk a little bit about this before we dig into the meat of the presentation, the second section. So my feeling is that we talk about accessibility a lot. I've said that word so many times in this presentation already. But at the same time, we speak about it in a vacuum a little bit. We're told how important it is, but the fact of the matter is, unless you have somebody in your life close to you, a parent or a friend, who has a disability of some kind, temporary or permanent, who needs the web to be accessible to them, this is not, unless that's the case for you, then it's not really something that's close to your heart. In your everyday work, you're trying to build things. You probably have some pressure, you're trying to build things fast, and unfortunately accessibility very, very often makes it to the bottom of the list of priorities. So I want to talk a little bit more about accessibility, what it means, and also what are the sort of the quick wins or the easy ways to do it when you're not given the time to really do it properly. So the first thing I want to say is that it affects a lot more people than you might think. It's not just 100 users here, 100 users there. There's quite a few sources on this topic, and one study that I found is that it could, if you include various factors, and it could include up to 20% of your traffic in some situations. People that have some sort of disability, visual or other, and that number can be much higher if, like me, you're working in a healthcare field So that's something to think about, or something for the elderly. Not that many services on the web for them because they're not really geared for them generally. Accessibility, my second point, accessibility is not just about vision or screen readers. For example, so you have people with motor or cognitive or auditory disabilities. I don't know if it's somebody with an auditory disability, most of the time they'll be fine. How to help their situation will be mostly about closed captioning on videos. But motor disability, if someone has a motor disability and they can only interact with, say, keyboard shortcuts that maybe they activate using either voice or I don't know all the devices that exist. But in that case, if you want your app to be available to them, you need to think about that. So make it accessible, but how? Simply, there's two things that I want to highlight there. The first one is a tool by Khan Academy, which sort of like audits your website for accessibility. It's like a little bit like Lighthouse, if anybody's used Lighthouse. It's like a benchmark for accessibility on your website. It's really great. You just click on a button on your website and it just shows you everything directly onto your UI. It's wonderful, check it out, and you can get from this very, very quick tips and very easy to apply tips. And the second thing is download JAWS. JAWS is the biggest screen reader on the web. And try navigating your website, your app, with JAWS for a couple of hours, or even less if you don't have the time, but check it out and see what that might be like, and then you'll get a much deeper appreciation for the importance of accessibility and how to fix it. Okay, so quick summary of this first section called Won't Somebody Please Think of the Users, named after a Simpsons quote. I don't know if anybody recognizes. So the first one, was it the responsible choice? The second one, if it is the responsible choice, then be responsible about it and make it feature complete, and above all, accessible. Okay, getting to the second part. Won't somebody please think of the developers? So the section is about the code itself and API in particular. And some of the main points I'm going to try to make here are much more technical. And the first one is that the API decisions that we make are crucial. They have a huge impact on how you on what you can do. And the second thing is that it's almost impossible to foresee all the consequences of those decisions. I love word games, so I sort of put this up there as like a hangman kind of thing. If you can guess the first insight from this, I don't know, you'll get a prize from me. Not a PlayStation or anything, but some stickers or something. I'll find something. I'll give you S as well. And if before two more slides, if you guess it, shout it at me, and like don't hesitate to interrupt if you guess it. That'll be quite funny for me. Okay, moving on. No, okay, no, this is enough time. Come on, otherwise you're gonna guess it. All right. So, quick disclaimer: we're looking at controlled components versus uncontrolled. We're not really gonna get into that. And the second thing is that the code samples use React, but not really. They're very, very short, and I don't think it should matter for anyone that is not in the world of React. So. All right, there are plenty of lessons, I think, to be learned from native elements, as I said earlier, and specifically their API design. So I want to talk about this sort of kind of flaw, this weird thing that happens in the API of input. This is something that I saw in an old article, and what we'll do is we'll create first an input, okay? And the default type of an input is text. And I can query, I can ask for where the selection starts. If there's text selected, I can ask where it starts. Obviously, it's going to be 0 at first. And then I can manually set a selection range. I can say select from the first to the 9th character, and that's what that does. Now, if I switch my input type to a button, shut up, you got it. Stickers for you. Great. All right. Oh, no, I lost my track. Okay. So what I wanted to say here is that, interestingly enough, when I first saw where I saw this example, at the time, and this is only a few years ago, right? At the time, if you switched or if you used the button and you tried to get selection start, you would actually get a DOM exception. It would just a giant error out of nowhere. It kind of makes sense because obviously there's no selection inside of a button, but they're built on the same prototype. It shouldn't have discrepancies of this kind. So nowadays, though, you get null, which is probably more sensical. On the other hand, if you do now try to set selection range, you will get a DOM exception. It'll say failed to execute. The input element type does not support selection. Yeah, it makes sense. But I think that this is still sort of problematic and that it's a symptom of a component that tries, now the point comes up, it's a component that tries to do too many things. And this is really highlighted by the fact that input has 22 different types. And I'm pretty sure that there's one or more type in this list that I'm pretty sure I've never seen, that most of you have never seen either. I don't know, has anybody ever used do you know what the month input looks like? Or I don't know, color input is also pretty new, I think. Has anybody used date range input maybe? No? Okay, great. Because actually I made that up, date range does not exist. But it would be wonderful if it existed. I would really like to have that one as a default thing. Anyway, you see all this, and I think that what you can say about input is that it has a bit of too many personalities, and it's easy to make a joke about this today, but at the same time, input, as we saw at the very beginning, input came out in HTML2, I think in 1995. And JavaScript didn't exist until, I think, about a month or so later, after HTML2 came out. So there was no such thing as a JavaScript API for input. So the idea that input was being used for too many things could not have been thought of as a mistake at the time. And we'll ignore the fact that 14 of these are completely new and have been invented long after JavaScript. Anyway, the lesson here was obviously, yes, components should be small and do only one thing. Thanks for ruining it. I guess I did that to myself, but let's keep going. All right, so the second guideline I want to look into, it is, again, related to the first. We just said components should stick to doing only one thing. But at the same time, what if I took input, or the HTML gods took input and turned it into 22 separate elements? Would they all have a completely different API? And if that were the case, how much time would you be spending on MDN's website every single day? Would their servers be able to take it? I think not. So my next point is that components should reuse, and we're going to get to an example at the same time, components should reuse the same API. For many reasons, it reduces the cognitive load of using them. And also, if you are reusing the same patterns, you're just making it a lot more easier for yourself in the long run. 5 minutes? Okay. You're making it much easier for yourself in the long run because you can swap them out. So I'll give you an example. This is code that I have in the usage, where I'm using the select, and obviously it gets an event, and I get the value from e.target.value. If inside of my React component I do this, I pass to the onChange function an object that has target and value. Then I can just swap out an old regular HTML select with my component, and it works exactly the same way. You can even take it a step further, and you can, for example, in your component, create an event, and you just add to it target value. You pass onChange, and then in your original components, you have access to prevent default and stop propagation and whatever else you might want. I'm not exactly sure why you might want to do that, but I'm sure somebody might find a clever use for it. It's good to know. So reuse your API. Another aspect of native elements that's very hard to replicate and actually in some cases impossible is that they play well with other HTML elements. And what do I mean by that? It's simple. You put an LI inside of an OL tag, and you get a numbered list. And you put another OL inside of one of those LIs, and you get a nested numbers list, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3. So in other words, HTML elements have something called interoperability. In the case of form, for example, you get a bunch of things for free between the different, because of the interoperability of different elements and APIs. So, for example, if you place a bunch of inputs inside and you give them types and names, you gain access to the form data API, you gain access to validation, the browser will autofill them for you. If you have focus inside an input and you press, I don't know, Command Enter, then your form will be submitted for you automatically. And more than that. Now, when you're building something custom, whether you're just redesigning a select or engineering a completely custom input with its own behavior and its own looks, you're going to lose access to all of those interoperability features. And that's a huge downside. So the question is, how do we fix this? How do we make a custom input compatible with other web APIs? So in the case of forms, and please someone shout at me if I'm making a mistake by telling you this, but I believe that the best way to do this is to place an input type equals hidden inside of your custom element and to sync the values between them. Right? And even then, that's not a complete solution because it only works for form data API. There's still no autofill. It feels quite hacky doing it, and obviously it doesn't work without JavaScript. So that's a very partial solution. Now there's another solution that I want to highlight briefly, because I'm out of time, is the custom elements API and specifically the is attribute that comes with it. So you might say, hold on, custom elements and the is attribute, what is that? Hopefully some of you feel that way. If not, I can just go to the beach. But if not, let's pause for a minute and let's look at how this works, because I think it has a lot of potential. So as part of the custom elements v1 specification, you can create completely autonomous custom elements, basically just extending the HTML element class. But you can also extend existing HTML elements. So if you look at here, up here we say class plastic button, extend HTML button element. And you can do a bunch of stuff inside of it, animations, and so on. You define it as plastic button, and you say that it extends button. And then in the DOM, you place a button. You say is equal plastic button. And then it gains a lot of the abilities of a regular button. And it also works like a normal button. It just has the whatever you did that's just for you. And it's obviously backwards compatible, because if you're in an old browser that doesn't understand is, then it doesn't matter. It'll just get ignored. It's not super valid HTML for that browser, but it'll be fine. Obviously, this solution also has its drawbacks and caveats. You're relying on a draft specification that is also either not implemented in most browsers or hidden behind a flag. But this will be coming and very exciting and interesting to use. So when possible, give the gift of interoperability. I probably will not have time to do my last example. I'll try to do it very, very quickly. Basically, I want to look a little bit more into interoperability, the idea that you can't design these options. And this is, I mean, more than an interoperability issue, it's a flexibility issue. It's that the component assumes too much about how it's going to be used. There's no reason that you shouldn't have been able to place inside of an option an image and some text. So let's try to do this. You know, in practice, let's try to do this and notice how hard of a challenge it can be. So we say that flexibility would define flexibility in this component as it can either use strings like in a regular select, or you can pass it a custom component or some markup and it'll render that. So if you try to do this, the first way that would come to mind if you're trying to imitate the HTML API like we discussed earlier, you would create a select component and you would render inside of it an array of options. Right? And remember, this is a controlled component, so you can't really pass an on-click function to each option. It has to be through the select. Otherwise, the select is not aware of the value correctly. So when you do this, though, it creates other issues. It stops you from being able to build deeper, harder features. One that I love in particular is if you're using a select online, you can type a couple letters from the option you want to select and it'll just automatically highlight it for you, and then you just press enter and that option is selected. Here, it's going to be extremely hard because the select is not aware of the options themselves. So you have to switch to another pattern. Then you're forced to maybe do something like this, where you have an array of options, and instead you pass options to the select renders them with sort of a default options with its own styling, and then you can also do a slightly different version where you add option and you pass a custom options component. So what's the point here, and that's my last point, is that one of the hardest things about developing components is not knowing in advance the ramifications, the implications of every choice that you make as you go along. It's, if at some point in the process you realize that something's gone wrong and you're not going to be able to build exactly the thing that you want to build, you're going to have to take a step back, refactor, otherwise these issues will just keep getting bigger and bigger and you'll end up with a ton of technical debt and a big mess. So that's my last piece of advice: be ready to refactor. It's better than workarounds, and you'll be able to maintain it better in the long run, obviously. So, quick recap: make it single purpose, reuse APIs and existing API patterns, interoperability if possible, although very hard, refactor if necessary, don't be afraid to take a step back. And an overall recap, but I think we're going to skip that because I'm already over time. And that's it. Thank you very much.